This is AM Agenda. With me now, Liberal frontbencher Steve Ciobo and Labor's Shadow Employment Minister Brendan O'Connor. Steve Ciobo, Malcolm Turnbull last night, you heard what Tanya Plibersek had to say before the break. I want to ask you about this idea that Mr Turnbull argued that to win the political debate you've got to occupy the sensible centre. Your thoughts on that?
Well, I think to win the political debate you've got to show how government policies are sustainable and how they're stopping to steal from future generations to pay for today's spending. I mean, the fundamental difference between the Coalition and the Australian Labor Party is that it is only the Coalition that is attempting to live within our means, whereas Labor just keeps saying to the Australian people, don't worry about how much money we're spending, don't worry about the fact we're borrowing $100 million a day, the music doesn't need to stop, we'll just keep borrowing and spending and taxing and borrowing and spending. That's the difference between Labor and the Coalition. And I think when you talk about winning the political debate, it's about Australians instinctively knowing we cannot continue to live in a way where we're borrowing money from future generations to pay for today's spending.
Yeah, sure. That underpins a lot of the political challenge for the Coalition now to make that case. But do you think Malcolm Turnbull makes a compelling argument about the need to occupy the middle ground in politics, to occupy the sensible centre, as he described it?
Well, I think that's exactly where the Coalition is. The Coalition is in the sensible centre. We've got those who say we aren't hard enough on one side. We've got those who say we're too hard on the other side. I mean, to me, it just demonstrates that the Coalition's core values, and we are a broad church, we're a much broader church than the union-dominated and controlled Australian Labor Party, but the Coalition is attempting to occupy the solid middle ground and to implement policies that are in Australia's long-term interest.
Brendan O'Connor, the point that Steve Ciobo makes, and it's made repeatedly by Labor's critics, and it's a fair point, that where are the details, rather than sort of saying that the debt problem is rhetoric, shouldn't you be coming up with substantive alternatives now, rather than just saying that's unfair, this is unfair? You've got to come up with more than unfunded empathy, as Scott Morrison puts it.
Well, we'll present our policies before the next election. But the reason we've opposed the measures in the budget, Kieran, is because the measures were not something that were indicated to by the Prime Minister before the election. In fact, they were fundamentally at odds with what he said before the election. So we're not going to be complicit in the way in which the government's operating. We won't aid and abet the lies of the Prime Minister and the government. And yes, we do have an obligation to come up with our policies, but we are in opposition and we will present them well before the election, as I said. The problems with the government, Kieran, is that it's not whether they're in the centre or anywhere else. It's their measures. The measures of the budget are unfair on pensioners, on students, on the unemployed.
I guess the question with Labor is, But Brendan O'Connor, it's different for most oppositions in the sense that Labor built the debt in the last few years, and I guess to regain credibility in the eyes of many in the electorate, you need to do a bit more than what oppositions normally do to say, okay, you would be a safe pair of hands. That's what you need to do, given that the debt was built under the Labor government.
Well, I mean, I think I refute the way in which you've described that. We dealt with the largest economic shock to the global economy for 70 years, and if you look at our debt relative to the comparable countries, it is low. 10%, the mean average of debt of OECD countries, is not high debt, and we did so to ensure that we came through the global financial crisis better than any other developed nation. And I think it's therefore wrong for you to suggest that the decisions we made were not anything other than responsible. But of course then we need to have a plan to respond to the debt, but in a measured way where we do not expect the most vulnerable in our community to suffer and allow those who are doing very well indeed and not to feel any pain whatsoever.
Well, on that segues into our next discussion point, and that relates to the front of the Australian today, not fair welfare for the rich. Steve Ciobo, the Australian reports that 260,000 Australian households with a net worth of more than $3 million are still enjoying welfare payments of about $800 million per year. That's unsustainable, isn't it?
Well, look, I certainly think as a matter of principle that people who are obviously sitting on $3 million worth of assets are in a very strong position and probably don't need taxpayers' support. But there's a fundamental issue here, and that is that people can be asset rich but cash poor. And I think that's a really important distinction to make. But in addition to that, Kieran, the Social Services Minister, Scott Morrison, has made it perfectly clear, and let me take this opportunity to stress it again, we will not be incorporating the family home into the pension assets test. Full stop. That's what the Social Services Minister has said. I make that point again this morning. It is not something that we're going to do. And frankly, what we need to actually look at are structural changes that are going to have a more meaningful impact on the long-term cost of providing the kind of welfare, which is roughly 44% of our federal budget, that the Australian people expect.
So why shouldn't the family home be factored in? At least look at it in the longer term, not for those on pensions now or soon to be on pensions, but down the track, individuals like you and me. That why shouldn't it be? Why shouldn't it be considered to make it sustainable if the demographics are as the the reports suggest?
Well, as I said, I think it's really important to differentiate between asset-rich and cash-rich. They're two very different things. I mean, the Labor Party, and I think Chris Bowen put the argument when he turned around, he said, well, there may be a family, for example, who purchased a home in Sydney 40 years ago, have spent 4 decades paying that home off. Now, because of the big increase in asset prices in Sydney, they're sitting on a cash, or so I should say an asset-rich property, but they're still cash poor. So that's a very different scenario to someone who has $3 million in the bank, for example, who's able to draw down on that cash and actually be in a situation where they can, of course, fund their own retirement. But look, fundamentally it comes back to this, Kieran. It's unsustainable the way that it is. Changes will need to be made to the pension structure overall. That is the only way to ensure that we get our debt and deficit under control, and that's something that the Coalition is going to look at.
It's something that Labor's going to have to accept one time or another. You might not be willing to do that this morning, Brendan O'Connor, but every economist agrees with what Steve Ciobo is saying this morning.
We need to have a sensible discussion around these matters, but it's important to know what's often on the table. I think the problem for the government, however, Kieran, is a matter of trust. The fact is that, yes, it's true that the Minister has said he has ruled out family homes, but it's hard to believe a government when so many things were ruled out before the last election, and yet, of course, the government proceeded to contradict those undertakings after they formed government. So one of the problems for the government, I think, is that no one really believes what they say when they say, for example, the family home will be exempt from such considerations. And that's because, in a blink of an eye, we've seen the Prime Minister descend from a king to a court jester. He's now openly mocked in our community, and the government's in great trouble not being able to, I think, convince the Australian people that they have their interests at heart when they're embarking upon reform.
Okay, gentlemen, Steve Ciobo, your final thoughts on that before we wrap up, almost out of time.
Well, Kieran, I think that Brendan O'Connor, if he wants to talk about trust, has a fair bit of form in this space. I'm not sure too many people would trust Brendan O'Connor, given he was the Minister for Border. Well, mate, I think given you were the Minister for Border Protection and you saw more than 700 boats and 50,000 people come along here, mate, I don't think people take you too seriously. So it's nice that you've got a comment. You're making a point as an opposition member, but I don't think anyone's going to take you too seriously, buddy.
Are you one of the 39,
But have a good day,
Steve?
Brendan. Have a good day, Brendan. No, I wasn't. No, I was not.
We're out of time. Brendan O'Connor, Steve Ciobo, both of you have a good day. Nice to finish on that less than bipartisan note. Chat to you soon. A quick break, back in just a moment.